Anton, if you're sitting in the Kremlin right now, as Erik pointed out, there might be some kind of a reach out to the United States, to Europe, as far as Ukraine is concerned, a softening, as Erik called it. Maybe we can come to some kind of diplomatic solution here. But what does he do about things like NATO? Still a big problem with NATO's eastward expansion. NATO is going to be deploying military equipment, more troops next year into countries that border Russia. The United States has just announced that it's going to dust off the tanks that it put away after the Cold War, bring them out, put them back in the field. How does he handle that?
I think of all of the issues that Russia is facing in foreign policy, NATO expansion has been used the most effectively to mobilize public opinion at home, and at the same time presents the least immediate threat to Russia compared to, for example, what's going on in Syria, and the fear that if that conflict spins completely out of control, then ISIS fighters and other extremists will begin to pour into southern Russia, for example, into the Caucasus. So I think if we see major shifts in the coming weeks, they will begin on issues such as Syria and Ukraine, two places that are of much greater concern. Putin is a strategic thinker. I don't think he hopes that NATO is going to change its mind about any of its recent tactical decisions, and I think the Russians are perfectly willing to wait. The thing that they will, I think, be more amenable to discussing immediately will be this issue of the anti-missile shield. And there, they've got a lot of chips that they can trade, and a lot of issues that they can compromise on with the Americans and with the Europeans. But the fact that there are 1,000 or 500 extra troops in Lithuania, if worse comes to worse, this is not going to make a huge deal to what some people, are predicting could be World War III. This is not going to be a major obstacle for one side or the other.
Alexander, what do you think Mr. Putin's foreign policy priorities are going to be?
Well, I think that the first and major priority is going to be Ukraine. Now, we don't really hear much. We didn't really hear much about Ukraine, and basically Putin was saying that the Minsk format is going to continue, but basically nothing is moving, nothing is happening. And I would like to warn people, experts about, comparing Syria and Ukraine and so on. Syria, as I said already in previous interviews, is a sideshow for Russia. I'm sorry, but Ukraine is the major concern. And if Ukraine is not sorted out, or at least some sort of process begins, then I'm sorry, but the Syria is not going to matter to Russia. And Putin knows this very well. And Putin is hoping that if Trump becomes realistic when he comes into office, that maybe slowly the Ukraine issue can be resolved. There are already talks, for example, in the Kremlin about paying Ukraine for Crimea, some substantial amounts, but maybe divided into 15 years, because they understand that this process around Crimea has to move somewhere, it has to start somewhere. So I think this is the main issue. NATO expansion, whatever is being said in the Kremlin, it's not as seen as a huge danger at the moment. These, tactical moves, they don't really, change much in the structure, military structure in Europe. But Ukraine has to be resolved. The feeling in Moscow is that Ukraine has to be neutral. That is the ideal situation for Russia. So Putin will really, really have to think hard with his people how they are going to start this process with Trump. It's obviously a flexible thing. Concessions have to be given and so on. Maybe Syria will come in here as a chip, as a gambling chip. But I stress again, Ukraine is the #1 foreign policy problem for Russia.
Erik, you want to respond to that?
Well, of course, I think it's correct to say that Ukraine is one of Putin's primary foreign policy priorities. Unfortunately, however, there is a process already underway. It's called the Minsk II agreement, and Russia is not adhering to that agreement. If Russia wanted to be a more constructive player on Ukraine, it would adhere to the agreement that already exists, which means letting international inspectors from the OSCE come in to pull its forces out of the eastern parts of Ukraine and be a constructive player diplomatically. Russia is not doing that. So while Putin wants Ukraine to have this special status of being a neutral player between the East and the West, and for Crimea to become part of Russia, it also needs to respect international law, and it's not currently doing that, unfortunately.
Brian, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I mean, President Putin made it quite clear today in the press conference. He went over the events and showed that the onus for what happened in Ukraine was with the West. It was with the EU. It was with the United States. As he said, we had an agreement with our partners. That agreement was February 21st, 2014, whereby the Yanukovych government would cede a great amount of power, that there would be new elections, early elections, that the police would be pulled out of Maidan Square. And he did that, and Russia agreed, or Russia was in the room and signed on, and the next day there was a coup led by, and I'm not exaggerating, right-wing Nazi and neo-Nazi forces, militias, that seized the power, and Victoria Nuland in the US government and John McCain said, this is a new, wonderful day for Ukraine. Well, Russia's sitting there and saying, are you joking? And even today, the European Union agreement, which Yanukovych, all Yanukovych was saying is, I'm not ready to sign yet. He wasn't saying he's against integration into EU, but this was seen by the Kremlin as an effort to seize Ukraine and bring it into an American or EU sphere of influence. And I agree with the guest in Moscow. This is completely unacceptable. And what Putin did today was he just established the record. Now the question is, what does come next?
Anton, I want to move to something else, and this is something that we've been hearing for weeks, for months here in the United States. These accusations that the United States interfered, at least Russia interfered in the United States elections. At that news conference on Friday, he dismissed those allegations, and he noted that the Democrats did not just lose the presidential election, but also lost in Congress. Let's take a listen to what he said.
They are losing on all fronts. They are looking for the guilty one outside. This is my opinion. How do I put it? Dishonors them. One must know how to lose with dignity.
So this is something that's been making a lot of news here in the United States and to some extent in Europe as well, but it doesn't seem to bother him too much.
No, and there's no reason why it should. He has his hands full with Russia's economy and all sorts of problems. Everything we heard from Putin today is consistent with Russia's position on the hacking business. It's very difficult to seriously discuss this until firm evidence is provided for exactly who did what and when. So we're dealing with this sort of wilderness of mirrors and this postmodern narrative of internal memos that are leaked to the press, and no one knows what's going on. Is it likely that is it possible the Russians were involved? Sure, it is. All major countries are involved in hacking and surveillance. Putin is correct, however, about the nature of the Democratic defeat in this election, because it wasn't just about Donald Trump and the presidency. It was about the House. It was about the Senate. He didn't mention the disastrous showing in the governorships, which is unprecedented, let alone the state legislatures over the past 2 years and 2 election cycles. So, for the Democrats to project their poor showing over the past 2 years and sort of pin it onto the Russians is really grossly oversimplifying what is otherwise an absolutely fascinating and very controversial tectonic shift in American political culture, which we're seeing. And Donald Trump's victory was the tip of the iceberg, but there's a whole iceberg below that.
Alexander, one way of looking at these accusations against Russia concerning the election is that it was election rhetoric or election politics that we were listening to here. But another way of looking at it, and we hear it here in the United States, was that this was an act of war against the United States, that Russia made attempts to undermine the democratic process in this country.
Well, I don't really buy this act of war against America, and I generally find this talk about Russia influencing elections, and not just only in America, because Russia nowadays is accused of influencing pretty much everything that happens in Western countries, from Brexit to now is being accused of meddling in Germany and France and so on. So to be honest with you, in Russia, the feeling is that America was caught red-handed with the NSA spying scandal when it was hacking practically every living being in the world, and not forgetting the political leaders in NATO, in Russia, Prime Minister Medvedev's phone was hacked and so on. So to have this huge scandal, which for some reason was just sort of quietened down all of a sudden, and then after that, then accuse Russia of hacking into the Democratic Party's emails and so on, it just sounds childish and petty, because you don't really accuse other countries of misbehaving when you yourself have been guilty of absolutely massive interference into practically the whole of the world.
Okay, Erik, I've got about a minute left. So President Putin lays out his view of the world, his view of issues at this news conference. There's an exchange of letters. They are both very nice. Where do you see the future going?
Again, I think there will be this attempt to come together. Putin and Trump will probably meet at some point in the spring. They'll probably have a nice meeting. They'll release a nice press statement. And we're likely to see, I think, in the short term, maybe cooperation between Russia and the US in Syria, potentially also on the renegotiation of the Iran nuclear deal. But beyond that, even if some of these things that we discussed, lifting sanctions, pulling sort of NATO forces back, if those things were to take place, I have a hard time seeing this relationship staying positive for the long term. It's going to turn back to the status quo, and I think that's what we're facing.
Very quickly, Erik, in temperament, do you see Putin and Trump getting on?
I could see them getting along very well. I think Putin doesn't respect Obama. I think he's a weak person and a pushover. I think he and Trump will probably hit it off on a personal level. But again, I think the policy differences and the strategic differences are too great to keep the relationships at bay.
Okay, gentlemen, that's where we're going to have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us.